With video games being projects that involve all sorts of digital media, including visual art, animation, sound design, and more, music is a major part of the video game development process as well and plays a vital role in the overall player experience. There are plenty of games out there with unforgettable, amazing soundtracks, and I've personally played many that I've since added to my playlists on Spotify. So today's list is going to cover 10 games that I think have amazing soundtracks from a variety of musical styles. I'll also be listing some of my favorite tracks from each individual soundtrack because unfortunately I can't play the music directly due to copyright, but at least you can go look them up and get an idea of what the overall soundtrack's vibes are like. Doom has, since the first release, always focused on creating an amazing sound experience, and its soundtrack has always been a very defining feature of the actual gameplay experience. Doom 2016 certainly achieved just that with one of my personal favorite video game soundtracks ever released. Mick Gordon worked on the soundtrack for Doom and blended elements of different heavy metal styles such as progressive metal alongside things like industrial techno styles of music to create the aggressive, punchy, powerful, and insane soundtrack that solidifies just how intense Doom really is. Doom is all about fighting off hordes from hell of demons, and it only makes sense that the music would obviously match up to that sort of vibe. The vibe of Doom is one of destruction, and when you think about its soundtrack, it needs to also be as intense as the gameplay. I think Doom is probably one of the few games that I find I want to keep replaying just to listen to the music. It builds an excellent atmosphere, and it definitely deserves all the praise that it gets. If I had to pick my top 3 favorite tracks from Doom 2016, it would be Rip and Tear, BFG Division, and At Doom's Gate, but I'm pretty sure those are everyone's favorites too. A very different vibe compared to Doom would be The Witcher 3. Now, the dark fantasy game has an amazing soundtrack that I personally love listening to. With its powerful tracks, The Witcher 3's music really complements its world, its exploration, and its combat in a great way. The Witcher 3's soundtrack is quite heavily inspired by other popular fantasy soundtrack styles, but it does it in a way that works super well with the overall world. Composed and worked on by Marcin Sibilovich, which I hope I said that correctly, I personally find that it has some of the best sounds in any fantasy game I've ever played. The orchestral work is honestly off the charts, its tracks are appropriately placed throughout the game, and you feel the stakes in each moment alongside the soundtrack. I used to also play violin myself, so I really appreciate the work done by the orchestra in this soundtrack. Honestly, just downright amazing composition. If I had to pick 3 of my favorite tracks from The Witcher 3, it would have to be Commanding the Fury, The Trail, and Cloak and Dagger, but honestly there's so many I love from this soundtrack that picking 3 was a really difficult decision for me. From Software honestly does not disappoint me, even with Elden Ring's soundtrack, which I found a lot of tracks that I love from, even though it wasn't the most varied soundtrack, but still, I cannot deny that Elden Ring had a great soundtrack, but I'm not talking about Elden Ring today. I'm actually going to be talking about Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 honestly steals the show with its amazing soundtrack, and if you want to see what dark fantasy sounds like, I feel like Dark Souls 3 would be that soundtrack. Dark Souls 3 is one of my personal favorite Souls games out there, but beyond that, it has to be one of the best soundtracks for what genre of game it is. The soundtrack really enhances the dark, dilapidated nature of the world of Dark Souls, and it really does a great job of mixing choir with orchestral work in a way that honestly can easily send chills up your spine. Motoi Sakubura and Yuka Kitamura worked on the Dark Souls 3 soundtrack, and you can really hear the power behind each track that they made, so I honestly have to say that their work is phenomenal with this title. The music used in the boss fights is so good, the atmosphere is greatly enhanced by the soundtrack, and the music is just honestly overall really awesome. My 3 favorite tracks were almost impossible to pick, but these are the 3 that I finally decided to settle on: Soul of Cinder, of course, Abyss Watchers, and Vort of the Boreal Valley. Now, this is a completely different style, but I have to say the original 2007 Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 soundtrack is one of the best wargame soundtracks I've ever heard, and it's not shocking considering that Hans Zimmer and Lorne Balfe worked on it. If you want a soundtrack that will invoke a ton of emotion, that will make you feel every bit of action happening on screen, that sounds good even when you're not playing the game, and has great depth to it, then it's this soundtrack. Ever since I first played Modern Warfare 2, the soundtrack really tied it all together for me. I think that this soundtrack has the intensity of a movie soundtrack, but it works so well in a video game context. I really recommend the Modern Warfare 2 campaign soundtrack because it does sound amazing, and I have so many tracks from it that I absolutely loved. But here are the 3 that I think are the ones that I honestly can't stop replaying. That would be the main title title theme of course, Code of Conduct, and Extraction Point. But I will give an honorable mention to Rangers Lead the Way, I just had to add another one in. Alright, going into this list, I was going to pick one Assassin's Creed game, and then I looked at my writing playlist, which includes most of my favorite video game soundtracks, and I realized I liked far too many Assassin's Creed tracks, felt stumped, and decided to just include all of the Assassin's Creed games in this section, which will make it hard to pick my favorite tracks, but bear with me. Assassin's Creed, in my opinion, has some of the best video game soundtracks as far as the series goes, and it's honestly shocking how I have yet to find an Assassin's Creed game that I don't like the soundtrack of. Obviously, there are some that I do rank higher than others, but I don't think any Assassin's Creed game has a bad soundtrack, and it's really cool to see how different composers take on this series with each track. One of the neat things about Assassin's Creed is that it also takes influence from the culture and country that it's focusing on in the music. So, for example, Assassin's Creed Origins has a lot of Egyptian-style musical instruments and influence, and of course some of the other ones take from their respective countries and cultures. Overall, the orchestral work is absolutely phenomenal for the Assassin's Creed games. There's a lot of emotion behind the tracks, a lot of action-packed sounds. It's just a really good soundtrack set. Since there's a lot of games to pick from in this section, I'm just gonna pick 5 tracks that I felt like were the best across the series. Of course, there are so many more, but I really narrowed it down and singled out these 5 tracks in particular. Those would be Born of the Sun from Assassin's Creed Origins, Florence Escape from Assassin's Creed 2, Assassin's Lament from Assassin's Creed Mirage, Pirates Beware from Assassin's Creed Black Flag, the main theme from Assassin's Creed 3, and City of Rome from Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. But again, I had to really pick through my favorite tracks, which are a lot. God of War honestly does a great job at including some great tracks that really enhance the world, the setting, the story, and the action in the game. And God of War's soundtrack takes a great amount of influence from Nordic styles of music, but it's also just a really good soundtrack that has a lot of variation, but in a way that fits the game itself really nicely. I honestly love the tracks from God of War, and I felt like it turned the game into something much more worth playing and much more intense. I think that as far as soundtracks go, if you want one that you can feel really immersed in the game with, it has to be God of War's. I love the orchestral work, the motifs, the choir in the soundtrack. As someone that enjoys game music a lot, I think God of War does a great job with the soundtrack at achieving immersion. Bear McCreary really did a great job, and his talent is amazing in composition. If I had to pick 3 songs only from God of War, it has to be The Dragon, Stonemason, and God of War. We're traveling a bit further into the future with this soundtrack, and as far as the cyberpunk subgenre goes, Cyberpunk 2077 has some of the best music that I would use to describe what cyberpunk sounds like in my head. Cyberpunk 2077 has some amazing action-packed music that really helps to raise the stakes in the game itself with its intense tracks, its synth-style influences, and great drops. I honestly think that if there were a movie about a cyberpunk universe, this soundtrack would be that world. It's also no surprise that the same guy that worked on The Witcher 3 was one of the composers in the cyberpunk soundtrack, so go figure, but Zivulowicz worked alongside P.T. Adamczyk and Paul Leonard Morgan to make this amazing mix of music. There's a lot of things going on in this soundtrack fitting the vibrant and expansive world of cyberpunk itself. There are hints of Japanese styles alongside high-action, punchy techno music that makes for a very well-rounded soundtrack. 3 tracks from Cyberpunk 2077 that I love the most have to be The Rebel Path, Juiced Up, and Wushu Dolls. Far Cry 5 is a very different soundtrack than some of the other ones on this list, mostly because it includes a lot more tracks with vocals in it, but also because of the location of the game. Far Cry 5 takes a lot of influence from American-style music, with the setting being the mountains of Montana. Honestly, Far Cry 5's music is some of my favorite work, and I think it has a great vibe and atmosphere to it. There's a very light sound to the music despite the very uneasy setting, but it does a great job at tying everything together. Dan Romer did great at tying in, of course, all the aspects of Far Cry 5 from its darkest points to its message of hope and teamwork, as well as the influences of American musical styles. However, there's more than just the main game soundtrack, as there's also the When the World Falls track, which features vocal work with the Hope County Choir, and it has some really cool tracks on it as well that fit the feeling of Far Cry 5. You hear a lot of these songs on the radio when you're in cars and Far Cry. If I had to pick only 3 tracks from the game, they would have to be, of course, the main theme, which is one of my personal favorites, as well as Build a Castle and Our Country Made a Promise. Great stuff. I really recommend this track if you want a very different vibe from some of the other ones on this list. I'm a huge fantasy fan, so of course the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim soundtrack had to find a place on this list, and honestly it has a lot of places in my playlists in general. The epic fantasy vibes from this soundtrack are unmatched, and I think it has some of the best fantasy inspired tracks out there that fit the overall feeling of this world that Bethesda built with Skyrim. Jeremy Soule did a great job at blending the epic feeling of exploring Skyrim with its darker parts, its tense and suspenseful suspenseful parts and its calm and peaceful parts. The orchestral work, accompanied by the powerful vocal work in some of these tracks, is just phenomenal, and I think that the soundtrack enhances the experience of playing Skyrim. The world would feel honestly very empty without this track, let's just put it at that. Picking 3 tracks from this was obviously difficult, but I really loved Sovngarde, The Bannered Mare, and Dragonborn. And last but certainly not least on this list has to be Fallout New Vegas. This is a bit of a different one as it does take a more modern influence on the game, but it also kind of includes a bit of that vintage Americana style, which is really interesting. But honestly, New Vegas' soundtrack is one of the best at delivering the overall emotions of this game. Fallout New Vegas has a lot of emotions tied to it, like I just said, but it has a lot of suspense, uneasiness, danger, peril, but there's also things like hope and discovery and exploration all at the same time. I honestly find that the soundtrack as well as the radio songs featured in this game do a great job at enhancing the playing experience. One of my favorite songs from the Fallout New Vegas radio is obviously Big Iron. I'm pretty sure everybody likes that song though. But in any case, I think that there's a lot of Western vibes happening, seeing as it is a game that's set in the Mojave Desert, but the overall soundtrack does a great job at conveying the general tone of this game. My 3 favorite tracks from Fallout New Vegas has to be the main theme title, The Viper Sting, and The Gangs of New Vegas. The Fallout New Vegas radio is a bit different. I didn't really want to include any tracks from that other than Big Iron because they are more real songs, but in any case, the entire Fallout New Vegas vibe is awesome. I really like the soundtrack and the radio tracks. Those are really great songs. I definitely recommend you listen to Fallout New Vegas' track for sure. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed that video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe with notifications set to all so you never miss out on a single upload. Comment below your thoughts on these soundtracks and if there's other games that you love the soundtracks for as well. Don't forget to check out our website for gaming news, entertainment, and more. The link to that as well as all our other important links are in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you all in the next one.